How many people here have a practice, whatever that means? Good. And we'll be talking about that a little bit, and kind of sharing, and what are the opening opportunities for us the next 2 days to talk about what's important. As Soren said, it's an opening, not a closing, right? So these are opening opportunities for us to say, what should we be talking about? What are those things in the next 2 days that you're curious about, you're interested in? And so those are some of the things that we're going to raise in the panel. And I'm going to give you all a few minutes at the end so you can think about it. But instead of Q&A, it's going to just be, give me 10 or 15 seconds on what you think is important to talk about in the next 2 days. So then everybody will grab you and talk about that. But then we can know what these reference points are. And we'll continue that on, hopefully, in the dinner tonight, where it'll be open, connective style of dinner as well. You know, there's a sea change happening. We all feel it. Soren said it in the last Wisdom 2.0 conference. There's a lot of things that people are feeling. You know, how do we bring these Western science analysis and integrate them with Eastern practice? And how do we change the way companies are operating, both in ethics and morals and moral center, et cetera? People are trying to figure this out, and they're coming together, and this is awesome. How many people here are from the East Coast? Right? I mean, I think East Coast actually started this stuff, right? I mean, so why the West Coast gets all the big conferences and things, and Soren's there, and come on. I mean, this is the beginning of something that could be huge, right? I mean, you know, Dina Van Du's been doing this. How long, Dina? I mean, it's like 40 years, right? I mean, you know, he's Capallo and everything. Oh my God, this is where it all started. Where's Sharon? She's around. Sharon's back there. She's been doing it since 670, you know, up in Lenox, Mass. I mean, come on, you know.
I think the far East Coast started it.
Darn good point.
I don't think it's an Eastern thing. Far from it.
So that's hopefully what we'll talk about is where are those opportunities and what we're seeing. And so, you know, I'd like to actually ask these guys, you know, as we build our networks and continue to grow, you know, our own networks, where do we think the opportunities are? Or what are the hard questions that we should be asking ourselves, Barry and David, over the next 2 days? And before you do that, because I want to hear it, give me a minute on your own story. Where did you center? You came out of the closet, Barry, I know, and of meditating, and I heard that. But you know,
it had to be a pretty big closet.
But why do you care?
Well, briefly, I started practicing meditation when I was 17 years old, and it's interesting. You know, Soren worked with teenagers. I'm interested and have reported on a number of programs that work with teenagers. It's a time pregnant with lots of possibilities, and I feel very fortunate during that time when I was confused and could go in a lot of directions and passionate about so many things that it was a time when there was a lot happening with meditation in those days. Now, of course, it was largely Buddhist, and I quite willingly became a Buddhist. But once I became a reporter talking about Buddhism, if I was riding on an airplane, I'd stop telling people that's what I did, because as I said, the conversation ended. I mean, I might as well have said I gouged babies' eyes out, and like that was it. You know, we're done. So it became very exciting when I started to see people on the airplane have the magazine that I was writing in, and we could start to have that conversation. So, you know, I think that's kind of the arc of my story, and I feel very honored to be able to report on it and share these stories. Great. I also want to say Dan Harris is a very good friend of mine, and I'm sorry that he's sick, and I hope that he gets better. And I want to plug his book because I think he's probably sick because he's exhausted from writing his book. So when his book comes out next year, whatever it's called, which is his story of coming out of the closet as a meditator at ABC News, I think it'll be very interesting.
Absolutely. David?
So I began practicing Buddhist meditation when I was 19. I then spent a year in India, my junior year in college when I was 20 and 21. And then I had a personal practice for 10, 12 years or so. And I think I succumbed to a dichotomy I think is familiar to lots of people, which is that there's kind of my personal life, my practice life, and then my work life. And that's not tenable in the long term, I think. And about a year ago, when I was at the Financial Times, it struck me that there's got to be other people who are working with this same edge. And so I started doing some reporting, actually barely even reporting, some searching. I started asking questions. And I quickly found Janice Martirano, who's here in the audience and who I think you'll hear from very soon. She was still at General Mills at the time, and she had started mindful leadership coaching at General Mills. And I thought, let's go check that out. So I flew out to Minneapolis, and I wrote what turned out to be a cover story for the Financial Times Weekend magazine, all about mindful leadership. And it was the very beginning of my search, my inquiry into how mindfulness is showing up, mostly in the Western workplace, because that's where I am. And it then led to this book. And the last year then, for me, has not only been a process of reporting and trying to really scout out this territory, but also on a personal level of trying to be much more disciplined about not succumbing to that dichotomy, about actually not treating work as something other than my practice, but a part of it.
Bringing the walls down.
Yeah.
Between the two worlds.
Yeah. So I'm happy to be here.
That's great. Thank you. So what questions should we be asking ourselves the next 2 days?
All of them?
Well, I think some of the most interesting questions have to do with the different levels of benefit and types of impact that meditation and contemplative practices can have in a business setting. So at Mindful, we tend to think of, roughly speaking, there being workplace issues. You know, I was just looking at the Wall Street Journal yesterday, and they have in the personal journal they have a piece on distraction and how costly it is to not only to productivity and creativity at the workplace, but also in terms of health. So, you know, workplace issues I think are something really important to talk about because people are miserable at work.
So how do our tools and technologies and ideas how can it make business better? How can organizations better, healthier?
Yeah, and I think at the first level, it's just the health of the people and how are they doing? Are they getting enough sleep? Are they bothered by distraction and intense emotions? But then I think that next level that becomes really interesting is awareness and the level of leadership. How you begin to shift the culture to reflect the kind of discoveries that you're able to make because you have some stability. And I think it'd be great if we can explore both ends of that spectrum and be honest about how well we're doing on both of those fronts.
I sometimes think that before we get into the weeds, it's really helpful to do what a lot of people do when they start their own personal practice, which is get in touch with our intentions. And when I think about, what's the goal of whether it be stress reduction or create an environment for less distraction, it boils down to trying to reduce suffering. And that personally is the way I try to come at it. And I don't mean to sound too dour, but the truth of it is, I think if we can kind of loosen our understanding of that word.
Of suffering.
Yeah. There's a lot of room there. Because you talked about it. A lot of people dread going to work, second only to the dentist perhaps. And so I really think about, whether it's reducing stress, reducing distractedness, creating meetings that are more mindful, where people are more present. All those things come from trying to just tone down the level at which we suffer. And so I think whatever we talk about, whatever goal, whatever particular methodology we employ, it's important to be in touch with our intentions.
So what are those entry points then to reduce suffering? I've seen people go at, and there's lots of techniques to go after stress. Everybody uses stress as the entry point, right? At 9/11, I taught meditation at J.P. Morgan, a weird thing, right? But it's like, breathe, let's manage the stress of the moment. And people seem to respond. That was entry point for some. Depression's an entry point for others. People working ADHD applications now, it's another entry point. But then there's this whole other side that says, no, we can be better, right? We can be more efficient, more effective, more flow state, better teaming, the whole bit. There's many openings, I get it, but where do you spend time?
Well, again, at Mindful, when we responded to so many people who were saying that there ought to be a magazine and a media property generally and a digital presence that's kind of covering this whole area, we looked at the drivers that cause people to take up meditation. And a lot of the drivers have to do with pain points, as you were talking about, suffering. But also, the drivers for a large number of people have to do with being able to do things better, being more effective. Somehow, when I taught writing for many years and coached people in writing, they didn't know why, but they somehow felt this shouldn't be as hard as it is, right? So I think that particularly the people who might not be drawn toward coming through a kind of a spiritual gate might be much more driven by performance. And for the old line spiritual folks, that's not what we're used to emphasizing. But I think both of those are very important.
I mean, there's so many doors in, and that's part of the beauty of everyone's practice. And that's why we're seeing it show up in such a variety of ways. I mean, when I've gone to different companies around the country, I've seen mindfulness and wisdom techniques employed for stress reduction. I've seen them employed to try to heal broken workplace dynamics. I've seen them employed to try to lower workplace injuries on the job, on factory floors. And I'm not here to make qualitative judgments about, some are okay and some aren't. I think that's the beauty of this, and that's why we're all here, is that there are so many practices. But again, I think that it's important to be in touch with our intentions, especially perhaps when we talk about these performance enhancement techniques. Because I think it's very easy to employ certain techniques, but lose touch with what we're actually after. I think mindfulness, for example, is not just an attentional stance. It's not just a way of focusing our intention. As Tara Brach says, authentic mindfulness leads to compassion. And that's an arc that I think we don't want to lose track of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can I say something about that, Jeff? Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that completely. I think in my experience, whether somebody comes in from the point of view of pain that they're trying to alleviate or trying to solve some kind of problem, let's say, or increase performance, if the kind of guides that they get are good and authentic, they come around to the same place. So, for example, a lot of leaders are not attracted to the notion of stress reduction. But people who teach mindful leadership in various ways, Janice and I think of Jeremy Hunter at the Claremont Graduate School outside of Los Angeles. After a while, old traumas get uncovered for these folks that they realize are part of the performance problem. So they end up back at that place anyway, and it works in the other direction as well. But again, I think it's if the guides are authentic, then I think that arc can happen. If they're interested in just a simplistic product, okay, everybody's happier now, then yeah, it gets stalled probably.
So, individual focused entry points. We're here at Google, do no harm as a company. So how do you translate some of this so that it truly has impact, right? Because there's some discussions about, are we changing the ethical center of organizations, or are we all just we're better people, but the organization still does what it does, right? So, have you seen, David, in some of your interviews of companies that have techniques that are actually changing things other than Google? Google's perfect, but other than Google.
So it's hard. I mean, really hard. Even for us as practitioners, whatever that means to you, to make just those little incremental changes in our life. We know how hard that is. So let's, what does it take to make a company of 30,000 employees start changing? It's not easy, and it's really early days. I mean, I think it's very exciting, and there's plenty to report about for a flourishing magazine. There's plenty to write a book about. But we're still at the very beginning of how we might employ this in the workplace. So I'd say,
some examples.
Let's not be too hard on ourselves. I just want to say, I think it's early days. That said,
not stressed.
So that said, I think it's going to be hard for a company like Google to really embody these practices fully as a company. And there's a lot of reasons, when companies get big, org charts spiral out of control, it's hard for one hand to know what the other hand's doing. And I don't think any of us should be under the illusion that just because there's a mindfulness culture in a company, that means every single person or every single division is going to be embodying those principles all the time. And I think for public companies especially, it's going to be doubly hard. Accountability to shareholders means that you have to act in their best interest. That doesn't always mean being mindful. And I haven't heard anyone make a convincing argument as to how we clear that hurdle. So when I think about the companies that are really starting to do their best to embody this, they're private companies. I spoke to Yvon Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia. And Patagonia is a good example, but still by no means perfect. But they're trying. Eileen Fisher, another local company here, she's trying. She's a practitioner. She's, especially in the last 15 years, as her practice has deepened, tried to embody those principles in more meaningful ways throughout the company, whether by using more environmentally responsible materials, by taking better care of workers in China. So there's many ways it can manifest. But Yvon, he pointed me towards a book. And this is, Barry was right on. This isn't about East-West or anything. He pointed me towards a book of French companies. He's French. French companies that have been around for 200 years or more. And he said, let's look at those companies, because those companies have survived. And capitalism today isn't oriented towards long-term success. But he said those companies haven't been growing at 15% a year. Those companies haven't been stripping their resources and plowing through one market and abandoning the next. Those, in many ways, have been mindful companies. They're 200 years old. They're enduring. And they've thrived over the long term by providing real value and taking care of the people in those companies.
Good answer. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of specific examples of companies that I've gone into and reported on, and Eileen Fisher is the cover of the next Mindful magazine. So I just hung out in that company for half a week a little while ago. And it's definitely an example of where the quality of mindfulness, for one thing, because Eileen Fisher herself embodies it, but also a lot of the people there embody it. It leaks into the entire culture and affects everything they do. And in fact, they don't crow about meditation all that much. You go to the various breakout rooms that they have, and they all have a little chime there. It says Eileen Fisher on it, and there's a chime, and every meeting starts with this minute of silence. And buyers who have come in and had meetings with them, and people in other industries have begun to adopt that thing. Again, as Eileen says, hey, it's just a little thing, but it spreads. But the culture of how people work with each other within Eileen Fisher and reach decisions is something wonderful to behold. And it's a deep commitment to collaboration. The next thing they're going to be doing is a program that they're calling personal transformation. Basically, people spend so much time at work, and so many of, as you were saying earlier, you can't have this dichotomy. You know, an emotional problem at home is an emotional problem at work, and vice versa. But it's interesting to compare how that program is going to manifest in a 1,000-person, $350 million a year private company that's partially employee-owned, as opposed to what I found at Google with the Search Inside Yourself program, or what I learned from working with Janice Martirano on her book, Finding the Space to Lead, working in all sorts of different industries, large public companies doing consumer products, big healthcare organizations. It's the old business adage of finding a need and responding to it. So the need at Google with the engineers there is much different than the need as it presents itself at Eileen Fisher, which is, has a large percentage of women running the company, and they have a particular culture having to do with the clothing industry. The culture in Google is much different. The scale is different. And when you go into a consumer products company, it's going to be different yet again. There is going to be more of what is conventionally called bureaucracy. But a lot of that has led to the making of effective products for so long. So I think we ought to be focusing not on what we can lay down on top of a company or an industry, but what does that industry tell us that they need, and how can we find the way in?
So how can you build change within each unique culture and make it its own, right?
Yeah.
And I worry a little bit about, we use the example, the CEO of Aetna is coming, right? And we use Eileen Fisher as an example, right? And we use Patagonia and the top guy. So does the CEO have to be the one that says, we're going to do this, and I'm going to lead the culture? Or can the culture bubble up and become a whole company? I mean, I'm not even sure the Google top management are meditators or mindfully focused. I don't know. And I know Ming's got views on that, and Rich and others. So I wonder about, what are the entry points? What stops this from becoming just an HR deal and turns into a really whole company deal, whole organization culture deal?
Well, it definitely goes bottom up as well. I think top up, there are lots of great examples. But Janice is an interesting hybrid. She wasn't the chief executive, but she was senior enough to get people's attention. At Adobe in San Francisco, that has bubbled up even from kind of more junior levels. It was a group that started meditating. Kind of a slightly more senior person took note, mentioned it to his friend in HR, and now they've trained 1,500 people across the organization. Very similar story is happening at Intel, where a small group of employees understood that practice was beneficial, even in the workplace, started sitting together. It went viral, if you will, and now they've somewhat institutionalized it. What you asked, though, is a somewhat different question, which is how do you prevent HR from kind of getting a hold of it? And I don't know that you can. These are big public companies. And if, 20% of employees are spending 20 minutes a day or a week, sitting in silence, they're going to want to know about that. And that's okay. The issue then, I think, comes right back to intention. Fine. So the HR is aware of it. HR might even support it. Why? Why is HR supporting it? Is it because they're trying to make their employees 20% more efficient so they can, keep making products that and, make the stock price go up? Or is it because they recognize a human need in their midst? They recognize that their employees aren't doing okay, and they make a commitment to fix it. And that's why intention is so important to me. So as these things grow, I don't know that they can be kept out of the hands of HR, and I don't know that that's a problem. But I think, again, we have to hold those HR managers responsible. And that might come from the bottom up, too. That might entail people who are participating in the program speaking up, telling them what this is really about.
Yeah, HR are facilitators, hopefully, and not the reason for all these tools and techniques to be brought out. But there are, so I've seen some companies, I'll give you an example, Bridgewater, a guy named Ray Dalio has 1,200 people who he gives access to TM training. And many of them take it. And he has a principles document. And what he claims is because of the mind training that he's gone through and his whole company's gone through, they see the world more accurately. And so they hold each other accountable. Literally, they challenge each other of telling truth, on a daily basis. Each meeting they evaluate. So it's really deep. But he's actually gone through and said, I'm blending the science. And this is what Dan Harris said. He said, one of the things I'd ask about is how do we move from the age of Aquarius to the age of science and kind of blend those? And so where can we start answering those questions as to what is happening? How can we build credibility behind, the science of it all? And there's lots of research, that's currently happening. How can we bring that to companies and in organizations?
I think the science discussion is an important one to have, but I'd like to back up. I mean, what does Bridgewater do? Well, what is the effect of a hedge fund on the world?
Good question. What is it?
Well, I would challenge Ray. It's as I understand it, it's to make a profit.
Right.
To make enormous profits.
He's made 25% for 20 years straight per year.
Okay.
So there's something.
But what does that do to the markets?
Is that good or bad?
What does that do to the markets? What does that do to the companies that they invest in?
Right.
And so, the employees may be challenging one another to be more accurate in their investment decisions, in as much as that, results in a higher stock price and that they can get out and turn a profit. I don't know that that's what we're talking about here. And so I applaud him for perhaps making the space for some kind of contemplation, but I would like to have a discussion with Ray about intention.
Mm-hmm.
Well, all right. Next Wisdom 2.0. We'll get Ray here.
Consider that an invitation.
Yeah. Sure, glad I didn't invite him.
Need to stir things up a little bit. Well, with a little bit of time we have left, I wanted to jump off from that to talk about one of the things that we've been learning at Mindful and Mindful.org for the couple of years that we've been reaching out and learning other people's stories and what their challenges are. One of the biggest needs we have is for good facilitators and teachers and trainers. And so what is the model for providing the world with all the various levels of trained people who not only have knowledge about mindfulness, awareness, kindness, and compassion, but also have the listening skills and the facilitation skills and the understanding of the fact that when you ask people to examine what's going on in their own mind, it's going to stir up some stuff. If you're doing it in a company, somebody might discover, I hate this company. I hate what we're doing. I don't think we ought to be doing this. So do you say, all right, well, too bad that, just shut up and meditate. This is, I think, called Wisdom 2.0, not Chill Out 2.0, right? I mean, real wisdom. What? wow, a clap line. Real
Use that in the next article.
real wisdom comes from being able to examine and inquire into your experience, which is really what mindfulness is about. It's interesting. The popular idea that you get calm, hey, that's just getting into the ball game. Then you got to see, how did I screw things up in the first place? And then how did we screw things up? So then you can have that engaged conversation about what Bridgewater is doing. If you're working in an industry, like the clothing industry, that, hey, we're all wearing clothes, right?
Hopefully.
They were they were manufactured. They were dyed. We think, okay, there's all this pollution that comes out of that, and we ought to really hold the company's feet to the fire. Where does most of the pollution come from in the cycle of a garment? It comes from the care of the garment, how we wash that garment by a large percentage. So Eileen Fisher pays incredible attention now to all of the stages of the chain, and they have problems. They know there are problems in that, and it's going to take decades to sort those out. So if you say, well, you're meditating in your company, great, but you're manufacturing overseas, so stop doing that. Well, it's not going to work that way, I think,
So I want to go.
I've covered a lot.
What you started with, I think, is still an important issue. How do we have enough people who are trainers, who are bringing a lot of this knowledge to the corporate world, to the nonprofit world, to universities, et cetera, and that there's quality service, right? There's a lot of people around. There's a lot of people who says, I can teach mindfulness, Coca-Cola, hire me. And you go, really? Good or not. Janice is coming up next, and she's going to have a whole really interesting program, I'm sure, the answer to all these questions. But what have you seen? And I worry about that. Is there certifications? John Kabat-Zinn did MBSR stuff, and he's go through long certifications and going to the hospitals, right?
Good. Long certifications are good.
So
at a certain level, there aren't enough trainers. Well, let's just put that out there.
Right.
There are not enough people who are ready and equipped to teach this at organizations around the country. That's obvious at this point. I think one of the problems exacerbating that is that a lot of the Dharma bums, if you will, of the last generation, the people that have spent a lot of time on retreat, who really have that knowledge, frankly, their path is a different path. They're more comfortable, perhaps, in the residential retreat environment. I go talk to Joseph Goldstein up at IMS. He has no interest in teaching Google, with all due respect. He's perfectly fine and happy doing what he's doing. And so I think right now we're at the very awkward growth phase where, yes, we need to train a lot of people very quickly. And no, there aren't the institutions that are equipped to do that. Even more so, there's no consensus on what training should look like. Now, there's some nascent efforts among the Center for Mindfulness and UCLA and Spirit Rock and IMS. All these organizations, which is one kind of pocket of activity, they know this. And they're starting to have the discussion about, well, what would training look like? Is there a way we can all get on board? But those discussions are very preliminary. And so there's no easy answer to this question right now. And I think we're at it's a sensitive time. And I'm of the opinion that kind of the practice takes care of itself in the long term. I don't need to worry about kind of preserving the authenticity about it. But we're in a moment right now where, as it spreads so fast, I think there is a risk that a lot of different versions of it get out there, and it gets very confusing to the consumer, if you will.
But you're not saying there's just one version.
No, certainly
obviously,
not.
But there's actually a set of quality standards that you could hold yourself up to, right? That we all should hold ourselves up to, right?
Yeah.
So how do you do that? I think this could be a really interesting place. Some collaborations could come together in the next 2 days to talk about how do we start talking about consistency across organizations and the way we talk about it, the way we work together for Business 2.0, et cetera, right?
Yeah, I think I would like quickly to respond to one thing David said about that we need to increase the number of teachers quickly, and that doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. As I think you would probably agree. Mm-hmm. It's an organic process. So we do have wisdom holders like Sharon and Norman Fisher and quite a large number of people. Joseph has made a particular commitment to the deep approach that he has, and that's fabulous. And we need Joseph and many Josephs. But there are also people who are reaching out. So how do we have everybody from the wisdom holder level down to the person who is in their early 30s, been practicing for a little bit, and they're very skilled in their particular industry. They get some good teaching, and they're able to be a mentor for the next person after that, and they're being mentored. So when they're 45, they're a different kind of teacher, doing a different kind of role, and et cetera, right up the chain. So it's not that. And I think we want to commission a white paper on what kind of models are we looking at. Should it be like a medical school type model? There need to be some sort of standards. If somebody goes into a certification program, they need to be able to fail, for example. There needs to be peer review and ongoing mentorship. We want to look at a lot of different models, and let's hear from people about their ideas about what the models are.
So in 30 seconds, I'm going to ask the audience if they have the point or an idea that they want to make sure is discussed in the next 2 days. So think about that just for a second or two. I believe in the how we teach and how we connect. Use of technology is a big question. How do we sit and figure out how to do online connection? Should it be live? Should it be recorded? Should you use Coursera? Should you use universities? Should we use institutes? And there's no one answers, but what group of all of this coming together, the life experience? I think there's not one coach. I think we as peers hold each other accountable. So how do you start peer networks going? These are all huge, really interesting, in my opinion, opportunities. So please raise your hand if you have something that you want to make sure is talked, and speak loud, or you can run back to the mic, either one.
I think I'm a loudspeaker. So the way you do one thing is the way you do everything. In my opinion, the way we organize the structures in our organizations lead to a certain kind of mindfulness that isn't very mindful. So my particular bent is how do we organize the way we work so that we can induce states that we get from sitting on a cushion. So how do we actually do that? I'm a software engineer, so Agile is one way in which I think that's happening. Create states within people while they're working so that there is focus, there is freedom to think and to do. So I'm interested if anybody has those practices about how we change the structures of our organizations to go non-hierarchical, to allow that to happen. We got 10 hours a day to practice.
Thank you. Yes?
Certainly the notion of turning our tools into meditation implements, because that has happened throughout history. Many of the meditation implements are actually also practical tools that people started out using. So we're talking partly about engagement with our tools in our daily life and practice and engagement of life. But there's also some interesting questions about the razor's edge when you're engaging the real world as opposed to meditating often a solitary place. And that's there are multiple kinds of compassion. Sometimes you have to have what they call tip of the boot love versus granny love, right? You need to, we saw an excellent example of that with, Ray, what is it ecologically that your function's actually providing to society? That's tip of the boot love, right? That's engaging, and there's tension. It should be productive tension. So this discussion of the balance between, the Kwai Chang Caine, remember the Kwai Chang Caine movie? So he, was very, sort of soft and feely, and then when it came time to kick butt, he kicked butt, and then, he was not poisoned by that. The other person was helped by that. This concept of this balance in the real world.
That's good. Yeah. Thank you. Next.
Yeah, this kind of question or observation comes from a movie, The Meetings of Remarkable Men, the life story of Gurdjieff. And in it, I was reminded when Gurdjieff went to see the great master, and the master pulled him aside and said, remember, it's not about the practices, it's about where the practices take you. And I think it's real important for us to remember that it's about developing a certain frame of mind, a certain way of being, a certain way of interacting with each other, not so much about the practices.
Thanks. Others? Yes?
I would like that we have some kind of formula, some kind of where we have working networks. So I know from talking to a few people, we're here from all over the country and maybe all over the world. How do we definitively set up networks that we continue to work together beyond this moment?
So set up, I think it's a good ending point. Setting up networks that continue to grow between the meetings. Yeah. And I think that's it's the collaborative glue that kind of holds us all together, and how can we set those up, or at least know that they're available to us. So thank you, David. Thank you, Barry. Really awesome discussion, and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you all.